April 14th, 1865. Just days after the Civil War had begun to settle, the United States was devastated by news that shook the entire nation. President Abraham Lincoln, the man many saw as the savior of the Union, had been assassinated. It wasn't just a murder, it was a symbolic act, one that marked a violent end to an era of conflict and transformation. By that April, the brutal war between the North and South had raged for 4 long years. The Confederacy was collapsing, its military efforts exhausted, its leaders on the run. But not everyone was willing to accept the defeat. A radical group of Southern sympathizers, led by the famous actor John Wilkes Booth, had something else in mind. They didn't want peace. They wanted revenge, and perhaps even a second chance at secession. Booth wasn't acting alone. His plan was far more ambitious than a single bullet. Together with Lewis Powell and David Harold, he intended to strike the very heart of the Union's leadership. Booth would kill Lincoln. Powell would attack Secretary of State William Seward. George Atzerodt was assigned to take out Vice President Andrew Johnson. Their goal wasn't just murder. It was decapitation of the Northern Command, hoping it might somehow breathe life back into the Confederacy's dying cause. Before we go deeper, let me ask you this. Do you believe a single act, one shot, one night, can truly change the destiny of a whole country? Think about it. Comment below. Your take might surprise someone. But to understand why Booth did what he did, we have to know who he was. John Wilkes Booth wasn't just a name that history cursed. He was born into a lineage of fame and drama. His father, Junius Brutus Booth, had been one of the most celebrated Shakespearean actors of his era. His brother Edwin Booth was a superstar in theaters across the nation. John followed suit, becoming one of the most popular stage actors in America by the early 1860s. At the height of his career, he earned over $20,000 a year, an astronomical figure compared to the average Northern family's income of just $300. But success on stage didn't calm the fire in Booth's heart. A staunch supporter of the South, he was obsessed with the idea that Lincoln's presidency was destroying the way of life he believed in. He longed for the return of the old order, one built on states' rights and slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, in Booth's mind, was nothing short of a declaration of war on everything he held dear. When Lincoln was re-elected in November 1864, Booth felt cornered. It was, to him, a personal defeat. He decided it was time to act. He could no longer play the passive observer. The war might have been winding down, but for Booth, the real battle was just beginning. Earlier that year, he had already joined a secret group, the Knights of the Golden Circle. They envisioned a slave empire stretching across Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America. Booth embraced this ideology wholeheartedly. He believed that Lincoln's policies would leave the South politically erased and economically ruined. Originally, Booth hadn't planned to kill the president. His first idea was kidnapping. He wanted to hold Lincoln hostage and force the Union to resume prisoner exchanges, a practice the North had halted to weaken the Confederate Army, which was desperate for reinforcements. So in the winter of 1864, Booth began recruiting conspirators. They met secretly in Washington, mapping out ways to abduct the president. Their plan: wait for Lincoln to attend a play at Ford's Theater, rig a rope and pulley contraption to lower him from his balcony seat to the stage, then spirit him away on horseback. It was a wild plan, theatrical, dramatic, and expensive. Booth sank thousands of dollars into it and put his acting career on pause. But it never happened. Lincoln's movements were unpredictable, and the plan kept falling apart. In March 1865, another opportunity slipped through their fingers. The president was supposed to visit Campbell Hospital to meet wounded Union soldiers. Booth and his men staked out the hospital. But Lincoln never arrived. He'd changed plans and was attending a ceremony at the National Hotel instead. Ironically, Booth was staying at that very hotel. If only he'd stayed behind, the course of history might have twisted right then and there. The Confederacy was collapsing. Richmond, its capital, had fallen. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had fled. On April 11th, just 3 days before his assassination, Lincoln stood on the White House balcony and addressed a hopeful crowd. The war, he said, was nearing its end, and he outlined his vision for reunification, bringing Southern states back into the Union with dignity. More than that, he hinted at something revolutionary: extending the right to vote to certain African Americans, especially those who had served in the Union Army. That was Booth's breaking point. The thought of black soldiers voting, having a say in the future of the country, drove him over the edge. In that moment, Booth decided Lincoln would not give another speech. That night would be his last. The next morning, Booth penned a letter to his mother. In it, he wrote that something heroic and decisive was necessary to save the South. That very afternoon, he visited Ford's Theater and confirmed that Lincoln would attend the evening performance of Our American Cousin. Booth had acted in that very play before. He knew every line, every beat, every burst of laughter. He knew the precise moment when the audience would roar loudest, and when a gunshot might go unnoticed. He also knew the theater's architecture like the back of his hand. The guards knew him. The staff adored him. He had access others didn't. That evening, he gave roles to each of his co-conspirators. Powell would enter Seward's home and strike while he lay recovering from injuries. Atzerodt would approach Johnson's hotel suite and kill him on cue. Booth, meanwhile, would slip into the president's box and do what no American had dared. Strangely, the night before the assassination, Lincoln reportedly had a disturbing dream. In it, he wandered the White House halls, passing into the East Room. There, he saw a covered body, wrapped in a funeral shroud. When he asked a nearby soldier who had died, the answer came coldly: the President of the United States. But Lincoln, with calm resolve, dismissed the omen. He believed it didn't mean his death, perhaps someone else's. And besides, similar strange dreams had come to him before battles, and Union victories had always followed. On the evening of April 14th, things did not go according to plan for the Lincolns. The couple struggled to find companions to join them at the theater. Eventually, Colonel Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, agreed to accompany them. Mary Todd Lincoln, suffering from a severe headache, was reluctant to attend, but the president insisted. Newspapers had already announced his presence at the performance, and he didn't want to disappoint the public. So, just shy of an hour late, the presidential party arrived at Ford's Theater. As they entered the theater, the performance paused. The orchestra struck up "Hail to the Chief," and the audience erupted into applause. There was a lightness in the air. The play was a comedy, and those present described Lincoln as cheerful, even relaxed, perhaps the most at peace had seemed in months. During intermission, the bodyguard assigned to watch the president's box, a man named John Parker, stepped out. According to some accounts, he left to grab a drink at a nearby tavern. Others say he simply wandered off. In any case, the door was left unguarded. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, that same tavern was where Booth waited. He knew the play's timing precisely. At 10:10 p.m., he entered Ford's Theater through the main entrance. People recognized him. He moved calmly, slowly, toward the second-floor presidential box. He wasn't stopped. He reached the door to the president's box, slipped inside, and secured it by wedging a wooden brace behind it. From that moment on, no one could interrupt him. Booth stood in a small vestibule, separated from Lincoln by just one thin interior door. On the other side, the president laughed along with the audience. At 10:15 p.m., the line Booth had been waiting for came, the biggest laugh in the play. The theater shook with laughter. Booth stepped forward, opened the door, and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The bullet entered just behind his left ear, shattered his skull, and lodged near the right eye. The president collapsed forward, gasping. At first, no one fully understood what had happened. The sound had been muffled by the laughter. Colonel Rathbone lunged at Booth, who dropped the pistol and pulled out a dagger. He slashed Rathbone across the arm, then turned, vaulted over the balcony railing, and got tangled in the decorative flags draped around the box. As Booth landed awkwardly on the stage, his leg snapped. But through the pain, he stood, raised his dagger, and shouted to the stunned audience, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. It was the motto of Virginia, a symbolic strike against what he believed to be tyranny. Many in the audience assumed it was part of the play. Booth limped across the stage, ran out the side door, and fled on horseback into the night. Back in the box, Mary screamed. The audience panicked. Some ran. Others froze. A young army surgeon named Charles Leal pushed through the chaos. He reached the presidential box and, with the help of Rathbone, forced the jammed door open. Lincoln lay slumped in his chair, barely breathing. At first, Leal thought he'd been stabbed. But as he opened Lincoln's collar, he found the bullet wound. The president's pulse was fading. Leal, knowing Lincoln would not survive transport back to the White House, ordered that he be carried to the nearest home, across the street, in the boarding house of a tailor named William Peterson. There, in a narrow bed too short for his 6'4" frame, Abraham Lincoln was laid diagonally. He would never speak again. Doctors arrived, including Lincoln's personal physician. They removed blood clots from the wound to ease brain pressure. But the damage was too severe. Throughout the night, cabinet members and officials gathered in silence, some weeping. All the while, Lincoln lingered, unconscious but peaceful. And through those quiet, grim hours, one man stayed firmly in charge, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. He began organizing the manhunt. He questioned witnesses, sent out riders, and took over presidential duties without hesitation. The Union could not afford to fall apart, not now. Have you ever wondered whether people like Lincoln somehow sensed their destiny? Do you think his dream was coincidence, or something more, a moment of clarity before fate struck? Share your thoughts in the comments. Some of the most profound answers come from your voices. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15, 1865, Lincoln exhaled one final time. Those in the room later said his face took on a look of serenity. Stanton, standing nearby, reportedly whispered the words that echoed through history, "Now he belongs to the ages." The nation went silent. Meanwhile, as chaos erupted in Washington, Booth was already racing south, across the Navy Yard Bridge into Maryland. The military had orders to stop all civilian crossings after dark, but Booth, injured but determined, talked his way past the guards. He met up with David Harold at the Surratt Tavern, where they had stored weapons and supplies days earlier. Together, they disappeared into the woods near the Potomac River. For the next 10 days, they hid, wet, hungry, desperate, waiting for a chance to escape to the south. Soon I'll continue with their flight, the failed attacks on Seward and Johnson, and the largest manhunt in U.S. history. While Lincoln's body lay still inside Peterson's boarding house, the city descended into shock. Mary Todd Lincoln, inconsolable with grief, refused to leave his side. Outside, a crowd formed, not chanting, not shouting, but standing in silence. Many wept. Some prayed. Others just stared at the windows, waiting for news they already feared to be true. By midday, Vice President Andrew Johnson had been sworn in as the 17th President of the United States. That same night, across town, the other half of Booth's conspiracy unfolded, or, more accurately, unraveled. Lewis Powell, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a chilling sense of purpose, approached Secretary of State William Seward's residence on Lafayette Square. Seward was bedridden, recovering from a serious carriage accident that had fractured his jaw and disfigured his face. Powell's mission was to finish what the crash had not. Accompanied by David Harold, who would guide him through the unfamiliar city, Powell knocked on the door claiming he had medicine to deliver. Seward's African-American butler hesitated. He was suspicious. But Powell was convincing, calm, assertive, and dressed like a delivery man. Eventually, he was allowed inside. On the stairs, he encountered Frederick Seward, the secretary's son. Powell tried again. He insisted he had instructions to deliver the medicine personally. Frederick refused. A brief scuffle broke out. Powell pulled a pistol, aimed, and fired. The gun misfired. Instead, Powell smashed the weapon into Frederick's head, cracking his skull. He burst into Seward's bedroom, where the secretary lay in bed, helpless. Seward's daughter, Fanny, screamed. Powell climbed onto the bed and began stabbing Seward repeatedly in the face and neck. What Powell didn't know, and what ultimately saved the secretary's life, was that a metal brace had been wired into Seward's jaw. The blade couldn't reach vital arteries. Seward bled, badly, but survived. Downstairs, a soldier assigned to protect the secretary rushed in. Seward's other son, Augustus, joined the fight. Powell, covered in blood, slashed wildly at anyone in his path, then fled. Harold, terrified by the commotion, had already vanished into the streets, leaving Powell alone. He wandered Washington aimlessly for 3 days before being caught. Meanwhile, George Atzerodt, tasked with killing the vice president, failed in a far more pathetic way. That night, he drank himself into a stupor at the bar below Johnson's hotel. Too nervous, too drunk, and too overwhelmed, Atzerodt asked the bartender odd questions about the vice president's schedule. Then he staggered through the streets until dawn, eventually discarding his knife and collapsing in his hotel room. He was arrested a few days later. As for Booth and Harold, they were still on the run. After several days of hiding in swamps and barns along the Maryland countryside, the two fugitives finally crossed into Virginia. There, they found refuge at the farm of Richard Garrett, a man who had no idea who they were. Booth, limping badly from his broken leg, claimed to be a wounded Confederate soldier. Garrett welcomed them with Southern hospitality. But the net was closing in. The Union had launched what would become one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Thousands of federal troops, detectives, and citizen volunteers were dispatched. Rewards totaling over $100,000 were offered, the equivalent of more than $1 million today. Photographs of the conspirators were plastered across cities, taverns, and telegraph posts. People were furious. The Union had lost its leader, and someone would pay. On the morning of April 26th, just 12 days after the assassination, soldiers from the 16th New York Cavalry surrounded Garrett's farm. Harold surrendered quickly. Booth did not. He barricaded himself inside a tobacco barn and refused to come out. For hours, the soldiers waited. They shouted, threatened, even set fire to the barn. Flames licked the night sky. Smoke poured through the wooden slats. Inside, Booth could barely breathe. Then a single shot. Sergeant Boston Corbett, peering through a crack in the wall, saw Booth raise his rifle and fired. The bullet struck Booth in the neck, severing his spine. He collapsed instantly. They dragged him out into the morning light. Paralyzed and gasping, Booth muttered his final words, "Tell my mother I died for my country." Some claimed he added, "Useless, useless." Within 2 hours, he was dead. His body was taken back to Washington, buried in secret, and for a time forgotten. Yet the story did not end there. Over the following weeks, a sweeping investigation led to dozens of arrests. Anyone who had even spoken to a conspirator was brought in. Eventually, 8 people stood trial before a military tribunal: Lewis Powell, George Atzerodt, David Harold, and Mary Surratt, the tavern keeper's widow whose boarding house had served as a meeting place for the conspirators. Also on trial were Samuel Arnold and Michael Oliphant, early participants in the kidnapping plot, and Dr. Samuel Mudd, who had treated Booth's broken leg. The final defendant, Edmund Spangler, was a stagehand at Ford's Theater accused of helping Booth escape. For 7 weeks, the tribunal heard testimony from 366 witnesses. The verdicts were swift. Powell, Harold, Atzerodt, and Mary Surratt were sentenced to death by hanging. And here's something to think about. Was Mary Surratt truly guilty, or was she executed for simply being in the wrong place, tied to the wrong men? Should she have been the first woman in U.S. history to be put to death by the federal government? Share your thoughts in the comments. History often forgets to ask the hard questions. The others, Arnold, Oliphant, and Mudd, received life sentences. Spangler was sentenced to 6 years. Mary Surratt's execution drew widespread controversy. Many begged President Johnson for clemency. He refused. On July 7, 1865, she was hanged alongside the 3 men, stoic and silent to the end. As the gallows fell silent and the conspirators' body swung, the United States entered a period of mourning unlike any in its history. Lincoln's body remained in Washington for just a few days. On April 15th, a solemn procession carried his remains across the street from the Peterson House to the White House, where he lay and stayed in the East Room. That very room, as it happened, was the same place Lincoln had seen the corpse in his prophetic dream just nights earlier. 4 days later, on April 19th, a public funeral was held in the Capitol Rotunda, attended by thousands. But Lincoln's journey wasn't over. On April 21st, a funeral train departed Washington, beginning a 13-day trip across 7 states. It traveled the reverse of Lincoln's 1861 inaugural route, stopping in cities across Maryland, Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, Indiana, and finally Illinois. The train traveled slowly, never more than 20 miles per hour, allowing millions of Americans to pay their respects as it passed. In every city, crowds lined the tracks. Bells tolled. Soldiers saluted. Families sobbed. It wasn't just a president they mourned. It was a man they believed had saved their country. On May 3rd, the train reached Springfield, Illinois, the town where Lincoln had risen from small-town lawyer to political legend. He was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery, not in a grand mausoleum, but in a quiet, tree-covered spot that his widow Mary said he would have wanted. "He always told me," she remembered, "he wanted to rest somewhere peaceful." And there he remains. But the questions didn't end with his burial. Despite the thorough investigation and highly public trial, rumors began to swirl almost immediately. Some said Booth hadn't died in that burning barn, that the body was misidentified, that the government had covered it up. Others believed the assassination was part of a larger conspiracy, orchestrated not by Booth alone, but by powerful men within the U.S. government. One theory claimed Confederate President Jefferson Davis had paid Booth to carry out the killing. Another, more sinister, accused Vice President Andrew Johnson of being involved, as the chief beneficiary of Lincoln's death. Still others suspected that Union generals, unhappy with Lincoln's plans for lenient Reconstruction, had secretly wanted him out of the way. And then there was the wildest theory of all, that Booth had escaped entirely, that the man shot in the barn was a decoy, that the real assassin had fled to South America, or the Caribbean, or the western frontier to live out his life under a different name. Books were written, anonymous letters sent to newspapers. People swore they had seen Booth decades later, living quietly under aliases in small towns. In 1977, author David Balsiger even published The Lincoln Conspiracy, alleging that top Union officials had been part of a plot to silence Lincoln forever because he was too forgiving to the South. Do you think Booth truly acted alone? Or is there still something we don't know? Buried in archives, sealed in silence, forgotten by time? Drop your theory in the comments. No answer is too bold when it comes to a mystery that still haunts a nation. Over time, most historians have dismissed these theories as speculation, the natural human impulse to seek more meaning in chaos. But what's undeniable is this: Lincoln's death marked the true end of the Civil War. His leadership had held the country together. His absence left a vacuum that no one quite filled. President Johnson's Reconstruction policies would prove divisive and ultimately lead to his impeachment. Racial progress slowed. Southern resistance hardened. And for decades, the promise of Lincoln's vision, a truly united, equal America, would remain incomplete. Yet his legacy endured. He was the president who preserved the Union, abolished slavery, and redefined the meaning of democracy. To many, he wasn't just a leader. He was a martyr, a symbol of what America could be at its best, and a reminder of how fragile that dream can be. That's the story. No embellishment needed. But maybe, just maybe, history is still writing the final chapter.